You have not just in terms of the weapons and throwing everything you have to Ukraine militarily, but you also had the US blew up Nord Stream, and now we have the Hirsch revelations that are just immensely, I mean, the global implications of this has to be included in this conversation because it shows that lack of patience too, because of course the US's strategy here was to weaken Europe. That was a lot of what this is about, to weaken Europe, to ensure that Europe was under its dominion economically, politically. And the blowing up of Nord Stream 2 and the Nord Stream pipelines, that has absolutely had just immense short-term impacts, like and that are going to be long-term in nature. What is your reaction to the findings? You know, now that I think all of us suspected that the U.S. was involved, Hirsch seems to have blown the lid off of any doubts that it could have been otherwise. And could you talk about the implications of this globally? Because I mean, Germany has been the one to suffer the most, but of course, this affects not just Germany. It's a real global problem to think about a superpower like the United States, an imperial superpower, doing what it did to Nord Stream. Hugely impactful.
You're right. It's actually quite frightening that the United States is this weak, insecure, and desperate, and then therefore dangerous, that they would blow up critical infrastructure of an ally, supposed ally. We all know that Germany is a lot like Ukraine. We see the U.S. waging this proxy war through Ukraine, and Ukraine paying this tremendous price, their physical existence, basically. The rest of Europe is really no different. The United States does not care what happens to Europe. They are trying to subordinate them just as much as they subordinated Ukraine, and just as much as they want to subordinate Russia. So the idea, and you can find quotes and you can see videos on YouTube of US officials openly behind podium saying, we can't have Germany and Russia getting together. That is our greatest fear, of them getting together. And why? Why is it their greatest fear? Because they're going to get together and attack the United States? No, because they're going to get together and Europe is going to come out from under the shadow of US hegemony that they've been under since the end of World War II. That's what this is all about. And it's the exact same problem the US perceives regarding China. It's not that China is a threat to the United States. It isn't. It's the fact that the US is going to lose its primacy over Asia. And when you think about it, US hegemony over Europe and Asia, these are two regions of the planet the US does not even reside in. Why should they have primacy over these parts of the world? It's very straightforward, but it's been going on for so long that people kind of take it for granted that it's that way. And some people in their minds may even think, well, it's kind of reasonable that the US didn't want Germany to be getting cheap energy from Russia. They wanted to sell the cheap, much more expensive energy to them, and keep them close to Washington rather than letting too many connections between Russia and Europe. And when you really think about it, and I remember this very clearly as Nord Stream 2 was being built, you could see all of these economic connections being made between Russia and the EU, and you were thinking, this is actually going in the right direction away from conflict, because there's all of these mutual benefits everyone on both sides is receiving. That was a joint pipeline. That wasn't just a Russian pipeline. It was a joint project with Germany. There were other European companies involved. And then Germany was going to receive this cheap energy from Russia and then distribute it across Europe. And everybody was going to make money. It was going to benefit industry in Europe, keep them competitive with the rest of the world. And the US completely eliminated all of this. It's all gone now. And they've physically blew up the pipeline. What are they going to do next? That's, I think, to answer your question, ultimately, what are they going to do next? Because they're this desperate to blow up the pipeline. Where do they go next? What do they do next? They can't stop it. They're too weak to stop it through competition. So what are they going to do next? By force, by terrorism.
Yeah, and you mentioned this comparison between Germany and Ukraine, right? The fact that both of them now are vassals. They're in this position where they're subordinated to U.S. interests. But what's, I think, stunning to a lot of people, I'm sure to anyone in the audience who lives and resides in Europe, is that Germany is really, I mean, it's really second in command in NATO. It's a huge industrial power. It's a country that has had a history, if not a sordid one at times, of having a really a global stature, right? A leadership stature in some ways. Now, I mean, we saw last year, February 7, 2020, this was, 2022, when Biden was standing next to Olaf Scholz and said, we're going to take down Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades. Right in front of Olaf Scholz. I think this is what's stunning to a lot of people, is how Europe has become so much of a vassal, Germany in particular, given that it is a huge competitor. It has a major industrialized economy. It could, in many ways, grow and surpass in a lot, if it were going in the correct direction, continue to grow and be a major player in the world. But now that doesn't feel like the case.
I mean, we often talk about U.S. political interference in places like Ukraine or, say, here in Southeast Asia. But the U.S. is doing the exact same process in Europe itself. They do it through somewhat different processes, sometimes the same processes. And what they do is they maneuver client regimes into power. The German Green Party, you know, all whatever it is that they're supposed to stand for, that is just a smokescreen. They are a client party, an opposition party created and existing for U.S. interests. And I've actually seen the German Green Party involved in U.S. meddling around the world. They're an accomplice. And so that's what you have in Germany. You have people in power who do not pursue Germany's best interests, or Europe's best interests. They are pursuing Washington's best interests at the cost of Germany and at the cost of Europe. And that is what we're seeing. And it's not just in Germany, it's all over Europe. The whole point of the European Union, the bureaucracy, was to kind of consolidate the whole process. Instead of working this country, that country, that country, let's just get one giant bureaucratic layer, lay it over the entire continent, and then all we have to do is bribe and coerce them, and then it'll trickle down imperialism to the rest of, and all the nooks and crannies across Europe. And that's exactly what they've done, and it was successful. And we see the result. It is the self-destruction of Europe. Can anyone honestly say anything Europe is doing now at this point is in the benefit of the European people? Even in the benefit of, say, European special interests, I would say no.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so, I think, interesting, given that you have a similar phenomenon in the United States. You have forces like European social democracy. I mean, Europe, the EU was supposed to be it's almost like this integration project, but it's on a completely different set of principles. So on the one hand, you have China and Russia pursuing integration in Eurasia, for example, but it's based on principles of mutuality. The EU was an integration project meant to empower the biggest European countries, along with the United States, to dominate the smaller countries and the weaker countries. And now it feels like that trickle down imperialism, as you called it, has kind of burst. It's kind of blown up, so to speak, in its own face. It's really backfired, because now you have the United States doing what it always wanted to do, which is to use the EU to weaken every respective country in Europe so it could hold dominion over the region. And now you have folks, and this is how sad, I think it's pathetic, and not even sad. I don't know how much tears we can wipe for these people, but you have people like Joseph Borrell, right? He's supposed to be a socialist, and he is talking about Europe's the garden, the rest of the world is a jungle. Recently, he was lecturing African countries, lecturing China, African countries about, there's going to be consequences if you skirt the sanctions. We're in war mode, and China, if you side with Russia too hard, we're going to make sure there are consequences. This is a supposed socialist, and he's been one of the most vocal supporters of this absolutely destructive proxy war in Ukraine, which has backfired on working people all across the continent.
It's a good point. And what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of these people are Western supremacists. And all of these other isms are camouflage because they can't just openly be Western supremacists. Although, what else can Joseph Borrell come out and say? Other, that's pretty bad already. We're a garden, they're the jungle. I mean, what else could they do but like throw in some slurs in there? Maybe that's the only way to make it more obvious. Maybe get himself a Ukrainian military uniform.
Right.
The problem,
flag, maybe.
Yeah. yeah. So the problem is you have people like this, and I've talked about this, and I talk with people who talk about this all the time. This is greed. It is unchecked greed. The system itself is corrupt. These people are finding themselves into positions of power because of corruption and nepotism. They're not qualified to be in these positions. They have a completely different system than, say, in Russia, and more so in China. And you were just talking about some of the differences. When Russia, China, and their nations along their periphery talk about integration, there is one principle that reigns supreme, and that's national sovereignty. When the West is talking about integration, they're talking about subordination and consolidation under one single system controlled by one circle of people. So it's an entirely different concept. And then also, when you look at the people running Russia, or even their education system, they prioritize practical skills, engineering, industry, manufacturing, things that when you look around at civilization, these are the physical aspects that make civilization civilized. And same goes for China. And then in the West, we've seen a complete departure for this, where the people running things are professional politicians, career politicians. They have never had a real job in their life. They have no useful skills. And there's a detachment between them and reality, and their agenda that they envision unfolding in their head and how it's actually unfolding in reality. And it is kind of just the tropism of greed, just this blind pursuit of power and wealth, and at the expense of everything else, including when you are so myopically focused on just wealth and power, you lose sight of really important things that actually play into your own self-preservation. And that is what's happened to every single empire throughout human history that has risen and fallen, and that is exactly what's happening to the West. And everyone seems to understand that this is what's going on. They understand how increasingly desperate and thus dangerous the West has become. A lot of countries are trying to just time out the clock, just let the time run out. They don't want to confront the West. And I don't think Russia or China want to confront the West, but at the same time, they have to protect themselves. And so we're going to see the West crossing red lines to provoke both Russia and China. We already see them provoking Russia. We see them attempting to provoke China. And so this is where the real battle lines are. It's between this dysfunctional unipolar system that's unraveling and multipolarism, and the concept of the primacy of national sovereignty versus this unipolar order that's still trying to impose itself on everyone.
Right. Yeah. No, those are great points, and I think this is a great place to now transition a bit to there aren't any questions yet, I don't think, in the chat. So for those who are in the chat, you can leave a super chat to ask a question for Brian, and I can read it. And also for those of you who are viewing this, you can subscribe on Patreon, on YouTube, or on Substack as a member and submit your questions before I interview guests, and I will read them toward the end of the stream. So you can find all those links in the description. But there are a few stories that I had kind of saved up because I find them very interesting. And so we've been talking about China, and recently there was a Munich Security Conference we mentioned before. There was an interesting comment made by a former colonel of the People's Liberation Army, his name is Zhao Bo. Now he works at Tsinghua University for one of their think tanks. one of their national security, international security think tanks. And he had something really interesting to say. Arnaud Bertrand, I'm going to pull up his tweet that has a clip from it, because I think I'd like to hear your opinion on this, Brian, because he makes a really interesting point. So before he answers this question, he's talking about how China isn't going to be a quote unquote world-class military like the United States anytime soon. However, because that's a lot of the questions that this DW journalist was asking, when is China going to catch up to the U.S. military? What will that mean? And he's saying, well, all we need to do is defend ourselves and our sovereignty. So there's that word sovereignty again that you mentioned, Brian. But then he's asked this question, and I want you all to hear his answer. So this is a former top senior colonel of the People's Liberation Army. He served in the Air Force, and he was stationed in, he had specializations, Asia, Africa. He's very prominent voice. That's why he still talks about these things. And here's what he had to say in response to the question of, well, what is the dangerous period coming up between the U.S. and China? When will that be?
And that is the time where you feel that there will be some kind of showdown, do you feel, between the US and China in the coming years in the Western Pacific? Is that becoming more and more inevitable?
No, I don't think so. On the contrary, I believe that will be the time when this relationship become somewhat stabilized.
So he's talking about 2030 and afterward. For context, he said 2030 and afterward, things will be stabilized, just so you know what time period he's talking about.
And before it becomes stabilized, this is the most dangerous time. So from now till that time, this is the most dangerous time.
So, Brian, there's been a lot of things that have happened recently that I think would kind of confirm what Xiaobo said there. There's of course been the huge military encirclement that we've talked about here together. There's been the Taiwan provocations. There's also been recently the balloon incident. The U.S. spent millions of dollars, it seemed like, shooting down what China says was a weather aviation balloon, and that they've spent millions shooting down supposedly similar balloons as well. And of course, there's a whole host of other things going on between the U.S. and China. But what do you have to make about what Xiaobo had to say there in terms of this dangerous period now until 2030? We had Mike Minahan as well with the leaked memo. What are your thoughts on what he had to say there?
Well, I had been saying that because we see U.S. military leaders, politicians, and the media saying, we're going to end up in a war with China over Taiwan, and they make it out as if it's going to be China that provokes the war. But as I've said over and over again, it's the United States that's in a big rush. And the question that was just asked and answered, after 2030, what happens after 2030? I'll tell you what happens after 2030. China is so powerful militarily and economically that the United States attacking China in any sort of meaningful way and thinking that it's going to get anything of any sort of positive outcome will be very unlikely. It will be kind of, everything is going to be inverted at that point, where the United States no longer has the ability to act with impunity on the global stage, and China is more than capable of protecting itself militarily and economically. And I've been covering this for years and years. China knows that they're being encircled. They understand that the West has all of these plans. The West writes about them in publicly available policy papers. You can download them from these U.S. government-funded think tanks. They talk about strangling maritime trade for China. China knows this. This is why they're working on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now they've got this cross-border trade with Russia. How is the U.S. going to disrupt that? But we see the U.S. even trying to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. They do it under the guise of competing. They've never actually built any competing infrastructure. What they've done instead is arm and back violent terrorists to kill the engineers working on these projects and physically attack the infrastructure itself. So this is what's actually already going on between the U.S. and China. I see it personally as a proxy war already taking place. The U.S. is killing Chinese civilians, businessmen, engineers. They've made attempts on Chinese diplomats. using these terrorist groups that they back. That is a proxy war right there, already ongoing, and not just in one particular area, but all along China's periphery. And China, this is why we see China investing in its military. It's so serious about building up this infrastructure to circumvent all of these ways the U.S. is trying to constrict and strangle China economically. And they feel by 2030 they will be successful. And not only will the gap narrow between the U.S. and China militarily and economically, but it'll start to broaden again, this time in China's favor. And that's when the U.S. will learn some manners and maybe some humility and act like a normal, constructive nation among nations at that point. But until then, and he's absolutely right, we have no idea what they're quite frankly, they are racist. They are racist and they are psychopaths, and they cannot accept the fact that a non-white nation is surpassing them, which is what is happening. It is almost inevitable. And we don't know how far they will go to try to stop that, reverse that somehow.